Now, today, we've got our very, very own favorite Prof. Clark with us today. Born and grew up in the wilds of Bechuanaland Protectorate. Tamed at Kimberley Boys High School, educated at the University of Pretoria for all his degrees, his BSc, his MSc, as well as his doctorate. He was appointed in the Department of Entomology at the University of Pretoria in 1977. He spent 13 years as head of Department of Zoology and Entomology, literally from 1989 all the way to 2002. He has published about 230 research papers and some books on SA insects and dung beetles. He retired in 2016, but because we love him so much, we can't allow him to do so with all the wealth of experience that he has. He is continued and he has continued to teach undergraduate students, supervise postgraduate students, and write papers and books, including some of the contents that he's going to be talking to us about today: the pollinators, predators, and parasites, the ecological importance of insects. Now, this is a very important talk for all of us nature lovers. Prof, we're looking very forward to it. Without any waste of time, the floor is yours, and to everybody else, I will see you guys on the other side of the talk. And please remember to just post your question on the chat or on the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we get that answered at the end of the talk. Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that with the forbearance of Eskom, we'll be able to get through this. I also must plead slightly guilty. I live completely off-grid, and I am dependent on the vagaries of the Wi-Fi on my farm in the deepest, darkest Karoo. So please bear with me if the signal gets a little bit wobbly today. It will be the signal and not me, hopefully. So anyway, we'll do the best we can. This is just going to be a fairly quick trip through the ecological importance of insects and their effect on natural and agro-ecosystems, and ultimately, of course, the health of our planet. I'll only be able to touch on some of the more important ecosystem services that insects provide, but each will, of course, also be a celebration of their beauty, not just their ecological importance, captured in photographs by my friend and collaborator, Annie de Klerk. And although I'll be talking mainly about pollinators, predators, and parasites, please, although I will definitely touch on my Wi-Fi and Eskom permitting, I will also touch on the other important groups of insects that ecosystems depend on. So what you need to bear in mind is, although I'll be talking about them in a sort of a linear fashion, where I'll be talking about a pollinator or a predator or whatever it is, we need to remember that every insect is a complex of interconnected parts. And I don't know if any of you have heard the ditty, but it's worth remembering that big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. And so this is really sums up what ecosystems are about and the individual parts of ecosystems. I apply what I call a 70% rule. It's not something that you'll find anywhere, but it's just something that I think is appropriate. It's that 70% of our plants are pollinated by insects. About 70% of all insects are eaten by predators or by parasites, and about 70% are responsible for detritus and dung removal, etc. So very important aspects of and elements of every ecosystem. So what we need to think of as we go through the talk is that every insect is part of a web of interconnecting organisms, each largely dependent on the other. So this third one of this web will have consequences for other members. And in some cases, these lead to cascades of ecological disturbance, even possibly ultimately to some kind of ecological disaster. I'll actually finish off the talk with one sobering situation of a cascade that we all need to be aware of. So without further ado, I'd like to, so this then is the essence of the talk. So not only pollinators, predators, and parasites, but also herbivores, decomposers, and then insects as food for other animals. And then throughout, we just need to take note of their beauty. And remember that the insects, as with plants, the beauty has a function, and it's not just there to please us, but it certainly gives us the opportunity to value them. Right, I don't expect this to be a, I don't expect you to read through all of this, but this is just the basic outlay of the talk that I'll be following. So pollinators visit flowers to collect nectar and oils and various other pollen, especially. And then the question that we need to ask is, you know, what's in it for the insects and for the plants, because obviously there's something in it for both of them. The insects collect different food plants, nectar for carbohydrate, pollen for protein, and oils in special plants, fats and amino acids. And then plants produce nectar or oil, often in excessive amounts at a physiological cost. So this has to be rewarded by pollination services. Also, plants and insects have had a very long history, the past 100 million years ago or so. So there's a very tight interdependence between insects and plants. And the insects are adapted in many ways. I'll be referring to some of these as we go along, various adaptations, and then I'll also be going briefly through the major groups of insect pollinators. Right, bees is the one group that comes to mind immediately when one thinks about pollinators. Bees have the advantage of being able to utilize both solid foods such as pollen and liquid foods such as nectar, because they have the specially adapted mouthparts, and we'll talk about that as we go through the course. Yeah, in this case, you can actually see the very distinct mandibles, so they can chew, but they can also lap and suck. They also have all kinds of structures for collecting pollen. Bees feed on nectar and a bit of pollen themselves, but most of it is used to provision their nests for their larvae. One of the other major groups is wasps, but wasps, the adults feed on nectar, as in this case here, but they collect some animal product in the form of an insect or a spider or something like that. We'll also refer back to them. So they have a mixed diet. The adults are nectar, the larvae are basically carnivorous. Another very pretty wasp. And then many of the structures on insects or associated with their activities are the fact that they have all kinds of, in this case, bristles, hairs that have a secondary function, and that is to collect nectar. Or at least pollen when they're busy on flowers. The hairs and bristles and that sort of thing have a primary function, usually some kind of tactile function, but they secondarily harvest and collect pollen. So here you can see a whole suite of a very big family of flies, that all of which are hairy and all of which collect pollen. Most a female. Male and female horseflies feed on primarily on nectar, but females then need a blood meal. In this case, this one is taking a blood meal from my leg. While I was saying violent things, while my friend photographer Henny was dithering about with the computer, with his camera, while the fly was sucking my blood. But the females need a blood meal for the eggs to develop. So they have a dual strategy. They visit flowers to collect nectar, and this one collects pollen at the same time inadvertently, and then they need a blood meal. Some of them have very spectacular adaptations, as in this long-nosed fly, rather appropriately named, where they can stick their very long proboscis deep down into tubular flowers to collect the nectar that no other insects can get to. So it's a highly specialized adaptation. On the West Coast, those of you who ever travel in Namaqualand will know this group. If you just about every flower, there's a very famous quote by an early entomologist at the Zika Museum, who spoke about the flowers and in Namaqualand, and said that virtually every flower was occupied by its beetle tenant. So these are some of them. These are called monkey beetles. They're hairy. All of them visit flowers, and many of them collect pollen, which they then distribute to pollinate. Another very spectacular group of insects on the West Coast. These are called long spoon-winged lacewings, is related to the antlions that we'll be talking about in a little while, but a very spectacular group and highly specialized pollen feeders. The long wings have other functions, which unfortunately we don't have time to go into. Moths and butterflies are very familiar to all of you. Moths and butterflies have a very long, thin proboscis, as you'll see in this moth, and then also in this butterfly, a long, thin proboscis. And because of the structure of the proboscis, they are only able to suck up very dilute nectar. So it has to be a tubular flower and very dilute nectar. So insects actually partition different flowers among themselves. So some will visit open flowers, others will visit closed flowers, and some will have highly specialized flowers, such as the long tubes that we've just referred to. Bees, especially honeybees, have, because they're social, they have a very complex social system. Some collect only pollen, as in this case here, and for that they have special pollen baskets on their back legs, and some others would collect only nectar. And honeybees divide up the duties in the hive, largely dependent on the age of the bee. So some of them will collect only nectar, some will collect only pollen, and in social bees, this is the case, such as these, but in solitary bees, such as the first few that I showed, the bees collect pollen and nectar simultaneously. So this is another advanced feature. Then some flowers produce oil rather than nectar, as in this twin spur, Diascia. And it's a little difficult to see, but this bee has equally long front legs with sponges at the end, and the oil glands are situated about there. So this bee has these very long legs, sticks them down there, soaks up the special oils, and then it takes those to its nest, where it mixes it in with pollen and makes a paste. These flowers the oils can't be extracted by any other insects that are not highly adapted. So this is a very, very important specialization, where the bee is entirely dependent on the flower and the flower is entirely dependent on the bee. So about some of these adaptations in the plants themselves, let's just look at, we just go back. Color, of course, is important, but then also the perfume, sweet perfumes, carrion smells, and then once again, also the morphology of the flowers, whether they have long tubes or dilute nectar or something else. And I'll give you a few examples of each of these. Right, most insects see in the bluer parts of the ultraviolet spectrum, and they're capable of seeing ultraviolet light, which we're not capable of seeing. So a lot of flowers, especially white flowers, will have some ultraviolet in them that the bees can see and use. So what we see is very different to what the bee sees. Some of the flowers that look orange to us also have a lot of ultraviolet. They're radiating, reflecting ultraviolet. And then a few insects, such as some of our butterflies, I'll show you an example, are capable of seeing into the red spectrum. Red is on the longer wavelength rays at the longer wavelength of the spectrum. And most insects can't see red. That's why when people researchers work with insects in laboratories, they shine red light onto them so that we can see what the insect's doing. But for the insect, it looks as though it's in total darkness. And just remember, of course, that the perfumes and the colors and that sort of thing that evolved for plants, and one of the reasons why we admire them and enjoy them is because of their perfumes and their bright colors, their beautiful colors. But remember that the reasons for that has got nothing to do with us. It's got everything to do with attracting the pollinators that attend to them. Now, carrion flowers, as the name suggests, smell like carrion, so not that popular in lounges, but nevertheless, blowflies like it. Yeah, and of course, for the blowflies, it's a dead end. They're attracted, they pollinate the plant, and sometimes they even lay eggs on the plant, but this dooms the eggs and the larvae to desiccation and to death, because the larvae are carrion feeders and they're incapable of surviving on a flower. So there's a lot of fooling insects into pollinating them, just in order to get the pollination services that the insects provide. Some of the special long-tongue fly pollinated flowers are some some orchids and some others. Some of the beautiful flowers wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the long-tongue flies. This rather bemused looking fly is totally covered in pollen, which is probably a waste for the plant, because that amount of pollen is not likely to be used in pollination. But nevertheless, this gives you an idea of the amount of pollen that bees are capable of, or at least flies, as in this case, this is a fly, is capable of transporting, but also that it's an excessive amount and a physiological waste. So the plants are maybe physiologically producing excessive amounts, but in return for pollination services. So there's a physiological cost to the pollination service. Here you can see this is a much more specialized case. The pollinia at the bottom, indicated on the bottom of the slide, are the pollen packets of certain species of plant, and the particular position of attachment is important. So they're attached in a particular place, and that they're carried and will be attached to the respective plant receptacles when the fly visits the next flower. Many insects are just flower feeders. They destroy large parts of the plant, of the flower. So many of them, this is a familiar one. For many years, we thought that this was a pollinator on proteas, the so-called protea beetle, but we now know that it doesn't pollinate these particular proteas, although they do pollinate some others. Beetles are usually fairly destructive feeders, but there's some return by pollen, even though they may feed on a fairly large percentage or proportion of the flower. They still end up pollinating enough of the plant for the plant to be able to reproduce. Many flowers have what the equivalent of landing lights for that airplanes need on land strips, and these are nectar guides or pollen guides or flower guides, and these actually show, they reflect mostly ultraviolet light that indicates to the insect exactly where the food is deposited. So this is another guise by the plant to get the insects to go directly to where the reproductive parts of the plant are. Some of the plants have used some other techniques. This is a very small fly on a daisy called a beetle daisy, Corteria. And the flowers, some of the petals have these hard black lumps at the base, and scientists have speculated for a very long time about what the function could be, but it turns out that the function is probably that male flies see these as females, and mating in flies is a rather delicate process. So the males just pounce on the females, and in this case, they pounce on what they perceive to be a female, which is nothing other than this black blob. When they pounce, they end up carrying pollen from one flower to the other. Another hypothesis is that in the early mornings, in Mackerland, it's pretty chilly in the early mornings, these black spots warm up, and the flies roost on them, and they then act as, sorry, I get a message that my internet connection is a little bit unstable, so if you don't mind, I'll just slow down a little bit. So just to get back, so the males pounce on them, thinking that they're females. Otherwise, in the early mornings, these black blobs warm up, and these tiny flies use them as heating pads on which to warm their bodies up. But many plants depend on insects for pollination, including some of our very famous and attractive plants, such as orchids. This one is being pollinated. This is a very rare orchid in the Drakensberg Mountains, pollinated only by the spider hunting wasp. Figs are pollinated by insects. Here you have what one has in a typical fig is these are not fruits, although this is the part of the fig that we eat. We call them fruits, but in fact, it's a capsule with flowers inside it, many flowers inside it, and there's just a layer of tissue around it. Now, every species of figs is pollinated only by a single tiny wasp, and the life cycles are very complex. So a mated female, I'll get to telling you in a minute where the mated females come from. Mated females will, to access the flowers on the inside of the syconium, it's called a syconium, they have to crawl through a tiny little hole called an ostiole. And the ostioles are very specific to the particular host. So, and even for the correct species to get in there, it's a tough job. And while the female crawls in through that little hole, she ends up losing her wings. She may lose some legs. She loses her antennae, maybe some mouth parts. But the important part is that she's able to still lay eggs. She then lays eggs on the developing flowers inside the syconium. Then these develop into male and female, small, tiny male and female wasps. Some of those females then would escape from the fruit, and some of the males would escape. Some of the males will mate with other females inside the fruit, and this is where the mated females then come from that escape and go to another fruit. But also, the length of her ovipositor, the egg-laying apparatus, is just the right length for being able to lay eggs inside the base of the specific flower here. The males then mostly die inside the plant and don't leave. But then there's some parasites that can't access the fruit directly because they don't fit through that ostiole. So the females have this very long ovipositor, which they drill through this fruiting body and parasitize other wasps inside the syconium. So the next time you eat a fig, those crunchy bits inside the fig, those are little wasps that you're eating. No, not really. They're not little wasps at all. By the time you eat the fig, the wasps have long gone. Those are just ripe seeds. Right, some of our proteas, there's a group of proteas called grassland proteas or savanna proteas, fairly low growing, and they are pollinated only by a group of these fruit chafing beetles. such as that one on the right there. Some red flowers. I said earlier that most insects don't see red. This is one of the ones. The Table Mountain beauty butterfly is capable of seeing in the red spectrum, and so they are the only pollinators of these particular red flowers. Usually red flowers are pollinated by birds, very few by insects, but the flower structure on these ones that are pollinated by insects encourage butterfly pollination rather than bird pollination as a result of different structures that they have on the flower itself. So what happens when pollinators disappear? Obviously, there's their grave consequences for the plants. One example that I would just like to mention is in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, the whole of northern KwaZulu-Natal was sprayed with DDT and BHC to control tsetse flies, which were causing disease with humans and livestock. And the whole spraying process has disturbed the pollinators of orchids. And so in many of those reserves that were set aside to keep wild animals, those reserves were sprayed more intensively than the rest of the area. And what happened then was that they managed, by spraying, the pollinators were destroyed. And so in many of those areas that are now national parks, where the spraying intensity was much higher than elsewhere, the pollinators have disappeared, and as a result of it, some of the orchids, the native orchids, have also disappeared. So the orchids have disappeared inside the reserves where there was intensive spraying, but have survived outside of the reserves where there was less intensive spraying. So we have absolutely the reversal of what's intended with conservation areas. We have a conservation area that's greatly disturbed. Right, predators. I'm going to be talking about various groups of predators, of course, because many insects feed on plants and other organisms, other bits and pieces. There's a lot of prey available, and so they are food for many other insects, and of course for other animals. Insects collect, sometimes they collect and kill food for themselves, or else they collect it and transport it for brood. We'll talk about some of these examples. Surprisingly, there are some insects that actually feed on vertebrates. So, and then we get such as, and I'll be giving you some examples of all these. We get some extreme specialists. We get ones that that feed in aquatic systems, and then the more common ones in terrestrial groups. I'll give you a few examples of each of these. Now, this is a particularly unusual example. This is the larva of a ground beetle, a carabid beetle, that only feeds on frogs. And the larvae go through 3 developmental stages, and each of the developmental stages feeds on a different frog. So the first stage, such as we have here, the beetle larva acts as a parasite, and it attaches to a frog and sucks blood, and the frog may or may not survive, probably does survive. Then it then drops off the frog and molts, and then the next stage has to find another frog, which it then attacks and sucks blood and starts to eat tissue. So the frog probably dies. It then drops off again and molts into a third stage, and then it becomes entirely predatory. And they attack frogs and eat the whole frog, leaving only the bones. There are all sorts of, there have been many studies on this group, and there are all sorts of rather bizarre stories about them. What the larvae do, what these beetle larvae do when they approach a frog, is remember frogs are insect eaters. So when the beetle larva approaches a frog, it twitches its antennae and its mouth parts and waves them around to attract the frog's attention. And then the frog comes closer and closer, and then the beetle larva leaps up and attacks the frog. But there are several examples in the literature where the frogs have actually beaten the larva to the jaw and swallowed the beetle larva. But the beetle larvae stay alive, and there are records of them being seen moving and kicking and squealing inside the frog for several hours, after which they get regurgitated, and then the beetle larvae then reattach to the frog and eat it, kill it and eat it. So pretty grim stuff. Then in aquatic systems, there are many fairly big insects like bugs that feed on this. This is a water scorpion feeding on a tadpole, a big bug feeding on a young terrapin. So insects, in some instances, may be important predators of small vertebrates. And then you get some really well-refined, some really neat predatory strategies. This is a cockroach hunting wasp. Now it needs the cockroach for prey, for food, for its developing larvae. But in order to get the prey to the nest, it has to get it there somehow. In many of these predatory insects, they drag the prey or carry it. This one has the neat technique of partially paralyzing the cockroach. So it stings the cockroach and partially paralyzes it. But the cockroach can then still walk. So the wasp then grabs it by its antennae, like reins on a horse, and pulls it gently towards where the nest is. It pushes it then into the nest, then stings it again to paralyze it completely, and then lays an egg on it. And the developing larva then starts to feed on the paralyzed cockroach. Then, in order to get prey, many insects use traps, all kinds of strategies to collect prey. You will have seen, many of you will have seen antlines. This is a nice example of an insect that many rural children play with. And the larvae, the antline larvae, dig these burrows, these pit-shaped burrows, and then ants and various other small insects tumble into them, and then they get eaten by the antline lying at the base. But because these holes, these pits are often dug in very exposed situations and in hot areas like the Namib or the Kalahari, the soil gets very hot. So what the larva does is it moves in the early mornings, if that's north above it, west on the left and east on the right. In the early mornings, when the sun's shining from the east, the larva, as the day gets hotter and hotter, it goes down and burrows down deeper into the soil. And then as the day cools again, the western sun, which is over there somewhere, is then shining onto the eastern side. The larva then moves up onto the eastern side to collect the sun's rays. Oops, unstable connection, I see. So if you don't mind, I'll slow down. But then in order to be able to forage optimally, the larva has to be active at temperatures that are very close to their lethal threshold. So they are able to determine almost precisely the exact temperature, which is about 36 or 37 degrees, that they need to keep their body temperature at for them to be able to forage optimally. As soon as the environmental temperature goes above about 39 degrees or so, they then threatened with being heat stress. So the whole system is not just a matter of digging a hole, but it's a matter of digging the hole and then being able to live comfortably in it. This is roughly what you would find at the bottom of an antline pit. Another insect that has a very well-developed strategy, this curious-looking thing lying here, is the head with the mandibles, huge mandibles, eyes, and a plate. And this is what the insect looks like. It's a tiger beetle larva, and they live in vertical burrows that they dig themselves. And when they're lying in wait, such as the previous one, they have this shield acting as a plug to stop anything from falling in or climbing in. So they lie in wait like this with the mandibles ready to strike. And what's another interesting thing about them is most insect larvae have poorly developed eyes, and their simple eyes are only good enough to distinguish between light and dark. In these particular species, because they depend on prey, they need to be able to distinguish, for instance, between a seed rolling towards them or some kind of an insect walking towards them that might be suitable prey. So when suitable, so they can actually visualize. So when suitable prey comes, they launch themselves out, but then they have another neat adaptation. They have an anchor lower down on the back that they anchor into the burrow of the vertebrate that they anchor into the burrow to stop them from being dragged out by struggling prey. So they then inject enzymes into the prey and kill it, and then eventually drag it back down into the burrow where they feed on it, and eventually then spit out the pieces. In aquatic systems, dragonflies, which are familiar to all of you, adult dragonflies are aerial predators, so they have big eyes to see what they're doing. And then they also have their legs, their four front legs placed fairly far forward, and they act as a capturing basket. So the basket, and then it's already close to the mouth part. So they are fast aerial predators. Their larvae, on the other hand, their nymphs live in water, and they have on the underside of the mouth, they have a hand-like structure that they shoot out to grab prey and then pull it in towards the mouth. But living in water, of course, requires special adaptations to breathe. And to do this, they have gills inside the anus, and they suck in water into the anus. And then the water flows over the gills, the oxygen is withdrawn, and then they squirt the water out again. And at the same time, they use that squirt for jet propulsion, for squirting, for moving themselves forward. So if you try and catch one of these, you'll see little puffs of mud behind them as they jet propel themselves along. Beetle larvae, beetle adults such as these, as you can see, it's floating upwards with its tail in the air. They collect a bubble of air at the water surface, and then they carry it underneath these wing cases. So it acts like an aqualung for the equivalent of a diver. It can last them for, in some cases, up to several hours underwater, breathing just from that captured bubble. And then more familiar terrestrial groups, such as praying mantises, which are known to many of you. The praying mantis, such as this one here, has these floral markings on it, and it's basically a flower mimic. So it sits there on a flower. It has these colors and bits and pieces sticking out that make it look like a flower. And then when flower visiting insects like bees and butterflies and that sort of thing come to the flower, they're attacked and eaten. Some other insects are highly specialized. These ones are specialized to feed only on millipedes. It's a big group. These are nymphs, immatures. Adults are yellow and black, but they have very toxic enzymes with which they can kill millipedes, and then they suck the internal structures out, the tissues. Some are very well camouflaged, as in this owl fly larva. You can see it's particularly well camouflaged against this tree bark. An unsuspecting blowfly then landed near it and got nabbed. This is a distant relative, also a lacewing, a very small 2 or 3 millimeter long larva of a particular lacewing. They race around on plants and prey on small prey like aphids. And because there's so much food available, many groups of insects have specialized. And here we have a very big family of robber flies, and many of them specialize. Many of the different species specialize on a different prey type. So there's one with an ant, there's one with a cicada, there's one with a bee, and there's another one with a beetle. So there's a lot of prey out there, so there's a lot of room for specialization. And then on the ground, some of you may have seen this. This is our biggest tiger beetle, monster tiger beetle, the biggest tiger beetle in the world, about 60 or 70 millimeters long. Those massive mandibles are self-explanatory. All the males, they're bigger, and they're used for holding females during copulation. This is a group, in this case, of black and yellow, or black and white, chemicals. So if they harassed in any way, they're capable of squirting out defensive chemicals to protect them. So many unsuspecting students of entomology have picked one of these up and got a blast it's a fairly low level of chemical, it's formic acid, but it burns like anything. And the warning colors, the black and yellow, are obviously warning colors there to discourage anybody from trifling with them. Then this is a group also of ground beetles, but these are called ant nest beetles, and they are highly specialized to live only in ant nests. And these strange looking antennae are basically just one big, each of them is just a big source of glandular secretions with many different openings, glandular openings. And what the beetles do is they then get closer and closer to an ant nest, and eventually they stick their antennae down. This produces interest from the ants. Ants come running out to see what's going on, and then they get exposed to these glandular secretions. The ants love them. They lick them, find them highly attractive. They then pull these beetles into their nests, where they can then feed. Oops, my connection is unstable again. Sorry about that. But rather that than Eskom. The beetles get dragged into the nest, where they continue to provide these appeasement substances for the ants. But in the meantime, they then lay eggs in there, and their larvae become predators of the ants inside the ant nests. But the larvae also have glands and produce appeasement substances for the ants. And while they are appeasing the ants either feed them or they allow them to prey on ant brood. So that was a group that uses chemistry to access the ants' nests. Here's a group of beetles closely related to fruit chafers and distantly related to dung beetles. Some of them look a little bit like dung beetles. And rather than using the subtlety of chemistry, such as the previous ones, these are robust, and they use brute force. So they just force their way into the ants' nest. As you can see, they're sculptured and they look hard and robust, which they are. The ants can't harm them. They just force their way into the nest and lay eggs in the rubbish piles inside ant nests. Now, many ants have a rubbish pile inside the nest with dead ants and remains of food items and that sort of thing. And these beetles then lay their eggs in the rubbish pile, and these are called tolerated guests. The larvae then of these beetles just feed on the remains in the ants' refuse, and they tolerated. They're ignored by the ants because they don't provide any they don't present any kind of thing. As soon as they become adult, they need to escape, because as soon as they become adult, they become vulnerable to attack or potential attack. Now, many predators feed on prey, on plants where they're exposed. So the prey is exposed, but the prey has some other mechanisms. I'll mention them in a while to protect them from some kinds of predators. But these ladybird adults and larvae are also brightly colored. They're full of nasty chemicals, so they discourage predation. Although they're exposed to birds and other predatory insects, the bright colors warn potential predators. Now, just to get back to some of the more specialist predators, this is one that might be familiar to many of you. It's a spider hunting wasp. They find spiders, usually a specific kind of spider, and sting it, only to paralyze it. It doesn't kill it, and then they drag it back, often many meters, sometimes flying, sometimes dragging the spider back to a nest, where they then lay an egg on the spider, and the developing larva then feeds on the still living spider. This applies to all of these predatory kinds of insects that cache prey for their larvae to breed on. The larvae usually feed on non-essential parts of the body, such as fat bodies and muscle tissues and that sort of thing, that are not used to keep the prey alive. And then the last bits that they eat are essential parts of the prey, which eventually then kills the prey, and just about the time that the adult is ready to emerge. Now they also are preyed on by wasps such as cuckoo wasp, which, like a cuckoo bird, they use the nests and brood of other wasps. They don't have their own nests, and these are hard and sculptured, and when they're attacked by a host, they roll up into a semicircle, and so that they can't be stung by the host. Famous Matabele ants will be familiar to many of you who live in the northern parts or the eastern parts of the country. You get big individuals called major workers, and then smaller ones called small workers, and these feed exclusively on termites. So they're termite specialists. After a raiding party, the big workers carry a handful of prey back. The smaller workers just carry one or two. So these are highly specialized only for preying on termites. And what's interesting is they also care for each other. If there's an injured individual, they get carried back on the underside like a baby in a carry, whatever you call those carry things that mothers wear on their chests with baby. The injured ants fold their legs up, and then their sisters carry them back to the nest. Right, something about parasites. Parasites of mammals in this case. This lovely looking teddy bear like thing here is a blood feeding parasite in the sinuses and nasal cavities of this group of herbivores, such as this black wildebeest. They attach mouth hooks there. These what look like eyes here are actually respiratory spiracles, so they attach there, and then of course inside the sinus there's a lot of mucus, and so they attach there, but then they breathe outside of the mucus. So these are blood feeders. A wildebeest like this might have a dozen or so of them all inside. Eventually, when they mature, they get sneezed out and they turn into a beautiful fly like that. Those are nasal parasites. The zebras and the group that they belong to, including horses and donkeys, often have a whole lot of intestinal parasites, such as this. I mean, hundreds or thousands of them. In spite of it, they don't seem to have a major effect on the zebras, but they all suck blood and eventually get excreted in the feces, and they turn into a fly, which then starts the process all over again. This is our biggest fly, the one on the left, it's the parasite, an intestinal parasite of rhinos. And the fly has a wingspan of about 70 millimeters or so, a huge fly. The adults don't feed, but they lay their eggs on rhinos' faces, and then the tiny larvae then find their way into the alimentary canal, where they then suck on the blood in the intestine. An early French hunter explorer who shot a black rhino and opened it up found that what he reckoned were buckets full of these maggots feeding on the blood inside the rhino, and he wondered if perhaps having such bad indigestion was one of the reasons why rhinos were so bad-tempered. Then when insects become parasites of other insects, we call them parasitoids, because the parasites of vertebrates, such as that one, very seldom lead to the death of their host. In the case of these insect parasites or parasitoids, they always eventually lead to the death of the host. So these white structures here are cocoons, pupal cocoons, not eggs, as a lot of people assume. And this caterpillar is still alive. So what happened was a tiny wasp laid, in this case, looks like about 10 eggs on the caterpillar. The tiny larvae then fed inside the caterpillar, once again eating all the non-essential parts of the caterpillar so that it could carry on moving and feeding and that sort of thing. Eventually, they will eat the essential organs like the heart and the nervous system and that sort of thing, eventually kill eventually kill the caterpillar, and then the next generation of small tiny wasps will emerge from these white cocoons. A very tiny parasite parasitizing an aphid. I'm sure many of you know what aphids are. These are small enough to parasitize the aphid and to have a whole larval life cycle completed inside the aphid. Some have very special adaptations. This particular one has an ovipositor of about 30 to 40 millimeters long, and they're capable of drilling through solid wood to parasitize wood-boring larvae that are feeding right deep inside the solid wood. So they have all of these techniques for locating prey. Now, herbivores, briefly go through plants, provide a huge mass of potential food for insects, but of course plants have all kinds of mechanisms to protect themselves. Some of these are chemical, some are physical. The insects are also exposed to the environment, to heat and desiccation, and then also, of course, predators. And then we'll look at some of the major groups. Now, these are larvae of a leaf-feeding beetle. They feed on solanum, which has all kinds of nasty chemicals in it. So what these larvae do is that their food is impregnated with the chemicals. They're resistant to the chemicals, but some of the chemicals are excreted in their feces. So these long brown strings are feces impregnated with chemicals from the plant. So anything that tries to eat that larva gets a mouthful of larva, but also a mouthful of feces impregnated with plant chemistry, which is repellent or toxic. Many insects that feed on poisonous plants, such as this locust on milkweed, are brightly colored to advertise the fact that they shouldn't be trifled with, because they sequester plant chemicals, toxic plant chemicals from their host plants. This one has the added advantage of a few bright colors for a primary warning, but it also has small spines that act like needles, like syringe needles, and each of them has a small gland at the base that has toxins. And if you touch one of these, the spines break off, the glands at the base of the muscles of the glands contract, and you get a squirt like a little hypodermic syringe. And many of these are very toxic and cause a great deal of discomfort to anybody who might be touched. The monarch butterfly, which is familiar to many of you, the larvae are chemically protected by bright colors. The adults are also chemically protected. They fly slowly and advertise the fact that these also feed on milkweed, so they're also chemically protected. Many bugs that feed on plants. This is an immature bug, and you can see in the middle of its back these two big shield-shaped structures. These are stink glands. You will probably all have encountered some kind of a stink bug at some stage. So here they have these yellow and black and white warning colors, but then if you trifle with them, they will also squirt those defense chemicals. So birds and various other predators are warned. Now, every part of a plant is utilized by some insect, so much so that even inside the leaves, you get tiny little insects, small beetles, small moths, tiny larvae that live between the two epidermises of a leaf, called leaf miners. And then a very specialized form of herbivory is one in which insects attack plants, and then the plant encapsulates the insect in special tissues. So you get these special growths called galls, G-A-L-L-S, galls developing wherever the insect laid an egg. So the one on the left is caused by a beetle, the one in the middle. Each of those develop into berry-like structures. Each has got a larva inside it. As it ripens, it turns reddish brown, and then eventually it drops from the plant. And the larvae bounce, they hop, and so you get like jumping beans. These jump into a shaded position where they then continue their development. And and these are the ones on the right are from tiny flies. All of these organs or structures, these galls, are formed by the plant in response to the insect. So it's a very specialized form for predation and various other, and the environment, because it's well insulated and well isolated inside. So it has a large benefit to the insect a benefit for the insect and little benefit for the plant. I see I'm running very late. Many beetles, as I was saying, the ones that live on the exterior of plants, such as these leaf beetles, are brightly colored. Many caterpillars have different shapes and structures, so as to either disguise them or to look like something else. Decomposers, I'll just quickly go through these very quickly. Termites are familiar to all of you. So remember, 70% or so of the wood and grass. This is a familiar, stable connection is unstable. Familiar sight on the Highveld in winter, these many termite mounds, each of those termite mounds with thousands of termites, each harvesting grass. And important to note is they also change the ecology around them, the chemistry around is, so you'll see they're very different plants around each termite mound. A wood-boring larva inside solid wood. Decomposition of carcasses, these are maggots in a reasonably fresh carcass. Beetle larvae on a slightly older carcass, and then the last remains the keratin. Many of you will have seen this sort of thing on game farms and that sort of thing, all these what look like tubes or spines sticking out of the horns. Each of those is the pupal case of a small white, yellowish white moth like this. And they feed on the detritus, the keratin, which is a very complex protein, but they're capable of digesting the keratin. And then nothing is wasted. Here we get these keratin feeding beetles feeding on the hair and skin remains in hyena dung. And then, of course, no lecture, no talk without a focus on dung beetles is appropriate. So here we have, just to show that competition, these fierce, big beetles, small beetles. And I love to give my statistic here of how important dung beetles are. Those of you who heard my previous talk may remember it. Cattle alone produce about 500,000 tons of dung per day. And here we're going into an election soon, so you can imagine how much the politicians are producing, and 70% at least of it is fed on and removed and buried by dung beetles. It's competition for the dung beetle, for dung is fierce, so some of them have to roll balls and to escape from the competition. Right, then food for other organisms. I'll end off with this. Even plants such as these Drosera, sundews feed on insects. And as an ornithologist friend of mine says, all my stories about the ecological importance of insects are nonsense. Insects are only there to provide food for birds. There's one caught in the act, glossy ibis feeding on dung beetles. That's a dung pat, a hoopoe, and a chameleon, some specific insects. And then finally, some of our most iconic mammals are entirely dependent on insects. Pangolins eat only termites and ants, so they're entirely dependent on them. And I'd like to end off with this. It's just an example of an ecological cascade, the sort of thing that happens when insect populations are affected. What happened in the Kalahari a few years ago was it was recorded that aardvark were dying, and they were finding very emaciated aardvark wandering around and eventually dying. And after some study, it was found that what had actually happened was because of the drought, termites and ant populations had crashed. So the food for aardvark had crashed. But it's not as simple as that the aardvark were starving. The aardvark were unable to get enough energy to be able to keep their body temperature up high enough. So in fact, the aardvark were dying of hypothermia. They were actually basically freezing to death. So that was that was all the result of the non-availability of food. But aardvark are ecological engineers, and their burrows, which they dig to sleep in, to rest in during the day, or to get to underground food, are used by multitudes of other animals because the burrows are deep, they're cool, they're sheltered, they're protected. So just the fact that termite, in this particular case, termites and ants were affected by temperature or global warming, we don't know. Their populations crashed, the aardvark populations crashed, the availability of burrows crashed. So all of those other animals dependent on aardvark burrows were ultimate recipients of the cascade. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I've gone over time, and I hope that the Wi-Fi interruptions weren't too bad. And then there's a little bit of propaganda for those of you to take home. I'll pass you over to John now.
Prof, let me say, this was absolutely fantastic, and we didn't have much glitches technologically as we would have thought. I don't know if I can, if you're able to hear me, Prof.
Clearly.
Oh, perfect. And for some weird reason, I just felt a drop in connection there for a second. Absolutely amazing, Prof. And I think we are becoming slowly we're becoming experts on this technology. We are able to just manage to get through, you know.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that, because that absolutely terrifies me. I'm sure something's going to go wrong.
Prof, I have to tell you, you are an absolute natural, because of where you see, I like the fact that you're presenting and you have this beautiful photos, and you're talking, you're telling us about this beautiful story about this beautiful insect, and at the same time you're looking at your Wi-Fi dropping signal. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, just then.
Yeah, Prof. Let's jump into it quickly. We've got a few questions, and I know we've been on the call for a while. I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody that has stayed throughout the talk. And we'll take a few questions, and some of the questions we'll post them online, and then we will get Prof to perhaps maybe interact with them, and then post some comments so that we can carry on these important discussions that we're having today. Let's start with Njabulo. Njabulo says, let me see. He had two questions. Okay, so the first one, I think he canceled, and then the second one, he says, thank you for this amazing talk, Prof. I am a marine biologist, master student at UKZN. I study marine as zooplankton. I'm also interested in birds and insects. Have there been any studies on chemical, genetic, or structural changes involved in the development or evolution of butterfly moth pods or moth parts? I hope I'm saying that right. I find the changes from a leaf-chewing caterpillar to a nectar-leaping butterfly very interesting. Prof, please take us through that.
John, I missed the middle part from something about chemistry.
Yeah.
So if you could just repeat that again, let's try.
Yeah, let me repeat that. So as he says, have there been any studies on chemical, genetic, or structural changes involved in the development or evolution of butterfly moth parts?
If I understand the correction, the question correctly, yes. I mean, there have been many studies, genetic studies, studies on plant chemistry and the effect on insects. I would suggest that Njobelo changes to his course from marine biology to entomology, and so that he can learn something really interesting.
Njabulo, there you have it. Please reach out to us also on social media, Straight Nature Facebook page, as well as Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden Facebook page. All these questions, we'll take them, we'll put them there, and let's just interact. And Prof has just given you a suggestion there, so let's do this. Ram has an interesting input. He is talking about two types of reports.
I think the Wi-Fi is tired.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Prof. I'm gonna just take it slowly. I'm just gonna try to be a little bit slower. Ram has an interesting input here. He says there are two types of reports, and the first one, it talks about insects are declining, and the second report says insect diversity is declining. Their numbers are not affected because their numbers are declining at some places, but interesting at other places, maybe they're picking up. What's the actual status in terms of insects?
Yes, sorry again, I didn't hear the whole question, but I got the gist of it, and I know what the question is about. Yes, worldwide insect populations are crashing. There have been some studies in various parts of the world, and the cascade effect has also been shown, particularly in Costa Rica, where they've got about 18 or 19 years of data, and they've shown that over that time, the insect populations have declined, and so have the birds and reptiles and amphibians that are dependent on those insects. So, you know, if we disturb any ecosystem, we can expect those sorts of cascades, and it's very obvious with insects. We don't have a lot of information on the situation in South Africa, but it's clearly something that needs attention.
Prof, having said that, that seems quite scary because of, you know, from the presentation that you've given, you've clearly demonstrated the interlinkages of this biodiversity need of having insects. And if we're having a decline, that would have a disastrous output on society in general.
Absolutely. And I mean, that is the point I'm trying to make, that each of these systems is dependent on all of its parts. And in many cases, the insects are fairly low down in the system, but many of them are what we call keystone species, where as soon as your pollinators, for instance, die out, then with it goes all the plants that depend on those pollinators. So the cascade effects are certainly something that we should be concerned about.
Sure. Prof, as I you know, move on to the last few questions that I have here. So what can we do? Are you making reference in terms of climate change, or, you know, our less adaptability in terms of climate change needs that we've got? What seems to be causing all this decline in insect population?
Yeah, I think, sorry, the internet seems unstable. I'll talk slowly and hopefully the message will go through. The evidence that has been collected so far suggests that any major changes to habitat, so whether that is as a result of climate change or as a result of development, some kind of farming development or dam building or something like that, anything that changes habitat significantly is likely to affect the insects. And the studies in both, two of the very well documented studies in Germany and Costa Rica indicated that it was mainly as a result of expanding agriculture and the use of pesticides close to natural habitat.
Sure. Very interesting. I've got Cam Mounting here, who says they loved your presentation so much. In fact, they would love to get in touch with you for a possibility of just working with you in terms of photography. And they've specified the name here, and I hope I'm not going to butcher it, Prof. It says, Cam says specifically Insud megachili sp hatching. I hope I'm saying that correctly. But Cam would like to get in touch. Yeah, Cam would like to get in touch and in particular to just have a discussion on this. And Cam is asking about possibilities of getting in touch with you via email. Cam, I can assure you that we'll make those details available. Please also check on our Facebook page, and Prof, perhaps maybe at the end as you're doing your goodbyes, you can share those details one more time with the rest of colleagues on the call. Let me take Christine. Christine says, I saw little blobs of white foam on a short gray bushes in the Namaqua Park over the weekend. It was so prolific, it looked like white flour on a plant. What insect does this?
It's a very interesting observation. Those blobs are wax, and the insects that produce them, different species produce different kinds of wax and different shapes of wax, and they cover themselves with it. So there's usually often a very small insect inside that blob of wax, and the wax is there to protect them from the environment and from predators and that sort of thing. And they're called scale insects, S-C-A-L-E, scale. So if you Google scale insects, you'll see there are many, many different kinds, and they have very many different kinds of wax covers. Very interesting group.
Sure. Oh, Prof, I think we're doing good for time, but let me just take just 2 or 3 last questions. And then let's wrap it up, so we don't keep colleagues on the call for too long. This one comes from Carolize, and it says, have recent good rains in Kalahari helped termites and arfakar? And let me take Gaby's question as well. Where do cordyceps fit in? If you can just take us through those two, Prof.
As far as the rain in the Kalahari is concerned, yes, of course. I mean, it's a very arid area, so rain is always beneficial. But what we need to always bear in mind that last year or earlier this year, it rained a lot in the Kalahari, but there had been several years of drought. So it's the years of drought that suppress the populations. They take some time to recover, even when we have good rains. So it's not a matter of everything being back to normal in one good year. We need several good years for the populations to build up again.
Sure. And then the cordyceps, where do they fit in?
Give me that the name again.
Cordyceps, so C-O-R-D-Y-C-E-P-S. Gaby, please, I apologize if I'm butchering this name. Cordyceps, Prof, ring any bell?
I think the word is getting lost between you and me.
All right. I'm going to repeat that one a little bit later, but before I do that, let me just take one last question, which is kind of a policy question from a planning perspective. It's coming from one of our callers on the line, and they're asking, do you think that the imposition of the new EU Green Deal program implementing pesticides regulation, when implemented into SA, will it be too late to save current declining insect species?
Well, it's never too late to improve matters if we can in any way. The emphasis with pesticides is internationally is to produce more specific pesticides and less general kinds of pesticides. But as far as pesticide use in general is concerned, it should be used only by experienced people and under very controlled conditions, because generally pesticides affect insects other than the target species.
Ah, lovely. Prof, I was trying to just get back onto that question of the cordyceps, but it seems to have disappeared. But Prof, I think in general, we've had over 100 attendees on the call, and all the guests are just so blown away by all the beautiful pictures that you posted, just the wealth of knowledge that you've got on this particular topic. At the end of Prof presentation, there was a slide just letting everybody know that there is a book on this particular topic, pollinators, predators, and pesticides. So please be on a lookout. In fact, go to Kirstenbosch Bookshop, get your hands on that particular copy. And Prof, maybe one of these good days we'll call you in so you can come and do some book signings for us. Oh, there, the slide is back. We are offering 15% discount from now until the next talk. So please go out, make sure you get yourself this book. I think it's absolutely amazing. There's lots to learn. There's lots that we can, I think anything that has to do with biodiversity and food security and just making sure that our planet is well protected. We all need to be champions of that and rally behind the cause. So Prof, any last words from your side?
Go out there and look for insects and enjoy them.
Beautiful. Short, sweet, and simple. Prof, you're absolutely amazing. Please enjoy your time. And
thank you, John.
If we don't see you again, please make sure you have a nice, festive break coming up. And we actually heading up to the last few talks that we're having. We plan to have a big get together with everybody on the call and just to hold a glass of something and say cheers to the very last talk that we have this year. So we will definitely let you know when that is happening. But from myself, let me take this opportunity to thank everybody that's working behind the scenes to make this possible. Belinda and the team. Kathy, you know how we always love you. Thank you so much for everything, for all that you do, and everybody for attending these talks and just being such great support of the projects and the initiative that we've put together. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you guys in the next 2 weeks when we welcome another speaker giving us a great topic. Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye.